Hi, everyone. You give it just a second as people are flooding in. All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome to SGA Spring Semester Town Hall. We're super excited to have all of you here as we talk about this. It's going to be a super fun conversation. And tonight we actually have with us Professor Jennifer Kinsley, as well as Dr. Andy Duverjai, who's the interim provost. They're going to be speaking about free speech. So very fun topic. Our first speaker tonight is going to be Professor Jennifer Kinsley, who is a professor of law and the Associate Dean for Professional Development at Chase College of Law. So Professor Kinsley, whenever you're ready, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you so much for having me tonight. I'm really looking forward to what I hope will be a meaningful conversation around the intersection of hate speech and free speech. And I have the pretty unenviable task of trying to explain to you in about 5 or 10 minutes all of the legal principles that govern the conversation about what is hate speech and what we can do about it. And so I want to start off, I've got a few slides here, so I'm going to share my screen with you. So as I mentioned, we're going to be talking about hate speech and free speech. What is hate speech and what is free speech? And before I dive into that topic, there's just a few principles that I'd like for us to notice or observe about this conversation before we launch into it. So first of all, just because you can say something doesn't always mean that you should say something. And so the conversation we're going to be having, at least, I bring the legal perspective to this. So I'm going to be talking to you a lot tonight about what you can say. But that doesn't always mean that you should say it, or that it's a good idea to say it, or that it's worth saying and facing the repercussions if you say it. And on a bigger note, or a broader note than that, I also want to talk for just a second about a concept that I call constitutional right sizing. So oftentimes we notice in society that when we talk about constitutional rights, things we hold dear, like the right of free speech, we tend to really elevate the importance of that principle in our dialogue. Right? I think we see this a lot in social media and in our conversations about current social issues. People tend to think that free speech is sort of sacrosanct, like the most important thing that we have. But I think that kind of blows the Constitution a little bit out of proportion. So here's what I always tell my constitutional law students in law school on the first day that they see me. I remind them that the Constitution is not a religious document. It's not a Bible. It's not the Quran. It doesn't create some gateway to a better afterlife for us. It's not a moral document. It doesn't teach us how to be good people. It doesn't teach us the right thing to do in all situations. And the Constitution also doesn't solve all problems. There are many problems in society and in the world that are outside of the Constitution and that the Constitution can't fix for us. So we have to keep in mind as we enter into this conversation that the Constitution is not the perfect answer. Instead, what it is a blueprint. It's a blueprint for government. And I don't know if we have any folks on this call tonight that are studying construction or architecture or engineering or any topics like that. But if you are, you know that a blueprint is oftentimes a two-dimensional object that then gets built. And the thing that gets built kind of takes on a life of its own, and it kind of looks a lot different than that blueprint originally envisioned. And I think the Constitution is like that too. The Constitution sets forth principles that we can follow as we build our government. And so the government we have now looks a lot different than the government the founders envisioned when the Constitution was ratified hundreds of years ago. So I just make that point for us to keep in mind that the Constitution is a starting point and it's one factor that can contribute to this conversation, but it's not the end all be all. It doesn't teach us everything that we need to know about how to be good people in the world. All right, now launching into what the Constitution has to say about hate speech. The Constitution and the First Amendment in particular take a categorical approach to speech. So there are categories of speech that are protected and categories of speech that are not protected. And I've got a little diagram here to kind of show you what I mean. So here are some categories when we start talking about kinds of speech or the kinds of things that people say that might come to mind. Things like political speech, advertisements, art, speech about sex and sexuality, speech about matters of public concern, and so on and so on. All of these categories fall within the First Amendment protection. These things make up the concept of free speech. Now, the Constitution also takes a categorical approach to kinds of speech that are not protected by the First Amendment. Things like fighting words. Fighting words are kind of this classic example when somebody yells fire in a crowded theater and people start running to get away. Fighting words are the kinds of words that provoke an immediate reaction in someone. Something that would be so offensive that you would have a violent reaction towards the person who said it. True threats. These are the kinds of expression, person to person, personally directed expression that is threatening some kind of physical violence towards someone. A good example of this would be if a person was sitting in a car outside of your house and they texted you that they were coming into your house to hurt you. This kind of expression is a true threat. It's communicated to place you in fear, and it is not protected by the Constitution. ILA, or imminent lawless action, also called incitement, a concept that we've talked a lot about as a country since January 6th. This is advocacy of crime that causes people to go out and immediately commit crime. A good example of this is a leader standing up in front of a big group and spurring them on to violence, something that President Trump, or then President Trump, was accused of doing on January 6th. Also not protected by the First Amendment. Next, we have LSD, libel, slander, and defamation, not the illegal drug. This is speech that causes reputational damage to somebody. Speech that might cause someone to think something negative about a person that is not true of them. Now, in the context of public officials and famous people or public figures, the standard for libel, slander, and defamation is much stronger. The hurdle that they must prove to show that the speech is unprotected is higher. And this is because we protect debate about public officials and matters of public concern. Obscenity and child pornography, these are a subset of sexually oriented expression. There are really specific definitions that attach to both of these kinds of speech. Just because speech depicts sexual activity doesn't automatically mean that it's obscene or child pornography. But once a particular kind of sexually oriented expression meets these tests, it is deemed to be not protected. And then lastly, one very specific kind of expression that I think does touch on the hate speech concept, and that's cross-burning. Now, cross-burning is a more complex kind of speech than you might have thought. Cross-burning that is communicated with an intent to convey a threat, meaning it is placed in someone's yard or in the vicinity where someone might see it, and therefore it might portend future violence. This kind of cross-burning is not protected by the First Amendment. But other kinds of cross-burning that are done for less threatening reasons are protected by the First Amendment. Now, this is it. This is the landscape of what the First Amendment covers and what it doesn't cover. Now, I want you to notice that one bubble I don't have on the screen is hate speech. And that's because hate speech is not a First Amendment category. The First Amendment does not treat hate speech any differently than any other kind of expression. It's simply not recognized as one of the categories. Now, what does that mean for us? Why is hate speech not a category? Why would our Constitution not extend First Amendment protection or exclude this kind of speech from its coverage? Why do we do this? Why do we have this kind of policy where hate speech is not a thing? So here are some reasons. First of all, the term hate speech has no commonly understood definition. What is hate speech to me might be different than what is hate speech to you. And more importantly, what is hate speech to the government might be different than what is hate speech to all of us. There's some really interesting research that has come out in the last few years by a woman named Nadine Strawson. She's the former chair of the ACLU, and she now teaches at New York Law School. And she's studied the criminalization of hate speech in other countries. And what she found is that when hate speech gets criminalized, it's actually used to further oppress minority communities. So instead of hate speech prohibitions being used to protect those in the minority, it actually gets used to further oppress those folks. And that's because we don't have a good understanding of what the term hate speech means. Now, here's another thing we need to think about. Hate speech is different from hateful conduct. The First Amendment might protect my hateful words, but it does not protect actions that I take out of hate. If I do something, if I commit a crime to someone because of a hateful motive or a hateful thought or reason in my mind, I can be punished for that. So we need to distinguish hate speech from hate conduct or hate behavior. Now, another reason why we might protect hate speech is because free speech needs what's called breathing space. If we were expected to be perfect every time we opened our mouth and every time we said something, what the end result of that would be is that we would probably stop talking. We would stop entering into debate. We would stop having conversations. And that's because we would be concerned that if we weren't perfect in our thoughts, words, and actions and attitudes, that we would be somehow punished. So the First Amendment adopts this idea that we need breathing space. We need to allow people to make mistakes. We need to allow them to enter debate in a way that might be uninformed so that they can learn and grow. The First Amendment also embodies the idea of a marketplace, that more speech is better than less speech, that the remedy for bad speech, hurtful speech, wrong speech is more speech, and that by having this robust dialogue, we will, as a society, reach greater progress. And so to have this marketplace, that means that we're necessarily going to need to include some bad ideas for the purpose of kicking them around, considering them, and talking about why they're wrong. The next one is a rationale that's kind of near and dear to my heart. And this is research that I've been working on since I've been teaching at NKU. Censorship can lead to violence. So there's lots of psychological research that shows that allowing people a speech outlet, allowing them to talk about their feelings and their thoughts, actually forestalls them from taking violent action. A lot of treatment modalities that are employed in prisons surround being able to talk about hateful, hurtful, aggressive ideas. And that through what's called cognitive behavioral therapy, people, by talking through their feelings, can change their feelings and attitudes and therefore commit less crime. On the flip side, when a person is censored, when they're muzzled, when they're silenced, when they're not allowed to speak, they tend to take the feelings that they are not allowed to express verbally and express them through angry action. And so there is this correlation between censorship and violence. And then lastly, there's this great quote. I think it gets paraphrased a lot. You may have seen it before. It's a quote that comes from Justice Louis Brandeis, after whom the law school at the University of Louisville is named, a Kentucky native. So he has a connection to us. He said that sunlight is the best disinfectant. And so allowing hateful speech actually is a law enforcement tool. And a lot of police officers and FBI agents will tell you this. They would prefer for extremist groups to be conducting their dialogue out in the open so that they can be seen, known, and apprehended. So sunlight actually helps disinfect these ideas and helps us as a society respond to speech that we find hateful and distasteful. Now, what does this mean in terms of regulating hate speech? So what can the government do and not do? What can we do and not do as citizens encountering speech that we don't like? So here are some methods of regulation. First of all, we need to distinguish between government actors and private actors. So the First Amendment only applies to the government. Now, NKU counts as the government, and this is kind of a complex question, and it would take me a semester to teach you all of the nuance. But just trust me when I say that public universities are the government. But private universities are not. Private companies are not. Places like stores and workplaces and social media sites, they are not the government. And so they have free rein to disrespect the First Amendment. Private actors do not have to buy into these categories that I showed you. And so private actors can ban hate speech, however they choose to define it. This includes social media, and we've seen examples of this recently, where people have been banned from certain social media platforms for engaging in hateful expression. Private actors can also punish people who engage in hate speech after the fact. We've seen examples of this too. I think this is what commonly gets called maybe cancel culture, where people's hateful thoughts and speech kind of surface later on in their life, and they are fired from their job or excluded from some kind of opportunity through private actors. So private actors have a lot more leeway to regulate hate speech, and that's maybe some good news for those of you who oppose hate speech. On the other side, the government, while it cannot directly prohibit hate speech, it can take action to stop hate speech if hate speech falls into one of those unprotected categories that I showed you. And oftentimes it does. So if hate speech is communicated in a way that is a true threat, the government can prohibit that true threat. If hate speech is communicated in a way that looks like fighting words that's going to produce some immediate lawless reaction in someone, it can be prohibited as fighting words, not as hate speech. The government can also use hate speech in criminal cases as evidence of a hateful motive. So if I commit a crime because I hate a certain person, because of their status, their race, their gender, their sexual orientation, my speech can be used as evidence of my hateful motive, and I can be punished for that conduct. And here's one last thing the government can do. It can enable a response. It can enable people who are opposed to hate speech and who want to express a better, kinder, more thoughtful idea to have a platform. The government can facilitate that marketplace that I was talking about so that the good voices drown out the bad and the good ideas rise to the top. So the government isn't powerless in dealing with hate speech, but it does have to respect the First Amendment limitations that are placed on us by the Constitution. So that's a little bit of an overview. I know that you may have questions, and I think we're saving those for the end. I'm happy to take them now or later, whichever is preferable to Lauren.
Yeah, if everyone has questions and they want to use the Q&A feature at the bottom of their Zoom, we'll go ahead and field those questions at the end for both panelists.
Thanks, Lauren, and thanks, Professor Kinsley, for that overview. And so I'm going to go ahead and share my screen real quick. And so Professor Kinsley did a great job of giving an overview of the First Amendment and what the First Amendment allows us to do and what the First Amendment does not allow us to do. And so what I want to do is I want to take it in a similar direction, but talk about kind of the dilemma we have as campus administrators and how we have to deal with these things. Because one of the challenges and concerns we often deal with is when an event occurs on our campus, when there is something that happens, many of our campus stakeholders feel that the university should take some sort of action. And I think Professor Kinsley did a great job of illustrating, what are we able to do when we talk about an action? I echo one thing that she mentioned, that we have to remember, part of the purpose of us being in universities and in higher education is to be this marketplace of ideas. And so just because there are ideas that we may not agree with or we don't like does not necessarily mean those ideas can't be on our campus. One of the things that I look at from my vantage point is, as we prepare you all as students to go out in the world and be informed citizens and make those tough decisions and really move society forward, we want to make sure you can do that from an informed standpoint. And so we strongly believe that being able to interact with individuals with differing perspectives, even the ones we don't like, help you going forward. And so, you have to think about that in the context of higher education and what we aim to do for our students as well when you think about speech issues and how we respond to them. So when you think about speech and you think about the things that you might see on campus that would fall under First Amendment or speech issues. And so what I like to look at this is from a practical standpoint. Like Professor Kinsley, I'm also an attorney by trade and did a lot of this work. But one of the things that oftentimes for students I see when I meet with them is, what exactly are we talking about? And so when you think about things on our campus or other campuses you may have been on, and we talk about implication of the First Amendment, we think about speech codes and other policies that curtail or prevent some forms of speech. Controversial speakers, in the last few years, we've seen a big influx of controversial speakers on college campuses, and we've seen the impact. Protests. This last year showed us anything. There have been protests across campus, across the nation, across the world around some of the things that are going on. And so again, these will be areas that First Amendment and speech will be implicated. Student events, bulletin boards, forums and blogs. And so these are just a couple of areas where free speech and issues of speech come into play. And so what I want to do is I want to talk about how other universities have responded, so you can see some of the things that are similar or analogous to what we've done here at NKU, and also some places where universities may have responded and they've gone over or outside the bounds of what they're allowed to do in the context of speech. And so I want to do that just to give us a larger level context of the decision-making and things we have to think about as we respond and deal with these issues on our campus. So two of the most common problems when you start looking at speech and policies and practices that universities have put in place to respond to speech or issues that maybe some members on the campus find offensive is making these policies overbroad. These are policies where what the policy is designed to do is not actually what literally it says it does. And so it becomes too broad, and there it's not narrowly focused on whatever the issue is at hand. The other area that becomes a problem that oftentimes universities, and I've been at places that have fallen guilty of this, is being too vague in the policy. We state some very flowery language that makes individuals happy about what we're saying, but it's not really clear what we're aiming to do, what we're set out to do, and what is it, or what a sort of behavior or form of speech that we're trying to eliminate or stop. So when we think about overbroad policies, the first thing we want to think about is we have to make sure that whatever our policy we create is narrowly drawn to address the specific evil at hand. So think about it in the context of a policy on NKU's campus around speech. And so, Professor Kinsley so eloquently stated, hate speech is not an area that's even recognized by the courts. So if we created a policy, and I've actually got requests for this before, we need to create a policy that eliminates or prohibits hate speech on campus. And so again, that would be a policy that was not narrowly drawn. We've already talked about the fact that hate speech is not actually defined. And so again, when we start thinking from that context, we want to make sure that we're not overbroad with our policies as well. Another big area that we want to look at is we want to make sure our policies aren't so overbroad that they sweep in at substantial amounts of protected speech. I've seen universities that, and I want to say universities, I've seen public institutions try to put in place, speech codes that said, we want to prohibit any speech that offends individuals that are part of a particular ethnic group. And so again, there may be information or there may be statements, and there are a lot, quite frankly, that would be protected. And so any policy like that would be overbroad because again, we'd be in a space where we're now prohibiting both, maybe illegitimate speech, but also protected speech as well. And again, Another big area, and this is one of the ones that I have to emphasize when I talk to our students, when our faculty, our staff, when we look at speech, just because it's offensive does not necessarily mean it would be unconstitutional. And so again, we want to make sure that we are not being too overbroad in our policies and our policy development. And so, when you think about things like us creating a speech code, we said anything that offends someone else, we'd be way out of bounds right there. That'd be way overbroad. And so I like to emphasize that, because oftentimes when I'm talking to students, they say, well, we should create policies and put things in place to stop this. And we have to make sure we're clear what the law says and what our ability is to actually enforce something like that. So we start talking about vagueness and a policy being vague. This is something where, individuals, the phrase from the law is of common intelligence must necessarily guess at its meaning. What exactly are we saying? What exactly are we trying to get at? And so when we start talking about things being vague, we've got to make sure that our policy is very clear about what we're trying to do and what is the purpose of what we're going on and what is the form of speech that we are trying to eliminate as well. Another thing we want to make sure is that we have to have adequate warning that the conduct is prohibited. And so we have to set out what those standards are applied. We can't after the fact say, hey, you said something we don't like and now we've created a policy and you violated that policy. We've got to be clear about what is the conduct, what are we allowed to do, what are we not allowed to do, and then use that information to move forward. So I always like to use examples to kind of illustrate what we're talking about and illustrate some of the issues that we see nationally. And so two cases involving two institutions that are kind of our major framework cases around speech and speech codes on campus. The first one being a University of Michigan case. And so this happened back in 1989. By way of background, like many campuses that we've seen even today, there was a rising tide of racial intolerance and bias incidents. And so in response to that, the administration adopted an anti-harassment policy that prohibited individuals from stigmatizing or victimizing individuals or groups on the basis of a bunch of different protected classes. And so think about it, to hear that language, stigmatizing or victimizing. And so as we think about it, what does that mean? What does that talk to? So University of Michigan looked at it from the standpoint of saying, flyers containing racist threats distributed in residence halls, racist graffiti written on doors, displays of Confederate flags in residence halls. They had situations where Black students were confronted from racially insulted by white students in the cafeteria. And so from an organization standpoint, from an institutional standpoint, those are serious issues. We know they're serious issues, but what is our ability as a university to actually respond to that? And what does that look like? And so as you think about it, as you think about the policy, it's interesting to see that the court ruled that the policy was unconstitutional because it swept within its scope a significant amount of verbal contact, which is questionably protected by the First Amendment. So again, as I first mentioned, there was a lot of things in there that they talked about that would be protected speech. We talk about victimizing and stigmatizing. Those are very subjective standards. And so those are going to be interpreted oftentimes by the listener. And so us creating policies or putting things in place using that type of language very, very likely is going to be very overbroad. And so again, that was an example where that speech code at the University of Michigan was struck down. The university was unable to do that. And so I use that example to illustrate that at NKU, that would be something, again, we would be unable to do as well. And so, Professor Kinsley talked about this, but it's really important to emphasize, we can't prohibit speech just because we disagree with the ideas. If someone comes and says something that I find vile and offensive, and I totally agree, that doesn't give me as an administrator here at NKU the ability to say, I'm going to prohibit that speech solely based on my disagreement with the ideas that are being espoused. And so I always want to emphasize that with our students to make sure they understand that, those are some of the challenges that we deal with. And so those are some of the things that we deal with as administrators as we respond to these issues. The next case that we dealt with was a similar case at another big institution, the University of Wisconsin. And so the student conduct rule enacted to prohibit students from directing discriminatory epithets at particular individuals with the intent to demean and create a hostile environment. And so I want you to think about that, a couple things. The intent to demean and create a hostile environment. We're going to come back to the hostile environment piece, but really focus on that intent piece. And so they use this to censure several students for making racial slurs against other students or other offensive comments. Very similar to the Michigan case, the court found this policy unconstitutional. And so what they found is that it covered a substantial number of situations where no breach of the peace was likely to result. So that fighting words test that Professor Kinsley talked about as well. And also that it was unduly vague and as ambitious as to whether the speech must actually create an intimidating or hostile environment. One thing it says with the intent, it said the intent. So again, is it the intent to create a hostile environment or is it actually creating a hostile environment? And those are two totally separate things. And we want to make sure we're thinking about that as we deal with these cases. Now, one area that I do want to focus on, and by my background, I think is important to emphasize. There is an intersection between the First Amendment and civil rights statutes. And so really what we look at is when we talk about discrimination on the basis of sex, race, color, national origin, you all know, I'm pretty sure, about Title IX basis of sex as well. And so it can encompass a lot of different things from a discrimination standpoint there. And so one of the kickers or the crux of what we want to make sure, because you may hear us and say, well, they said something based on race. That's discriminatory, and therefore we should be able to do something about it. And the emphasis has to be based on the fact that this information or this behavior has to create a hostile environment. And so a hostile environment is a situation where the conduct is so severe or pervasive that it interferes or limits with your ability to participate or benefit from the services we're offering here at NKU. And so think about that from a standard standpoint. It's got to be something so severe that it limits objectively your ability to benefit from the educational or work opportunity we're offering here. So, many of you have seen the situation where we have a complaint of sexual harassment, and there's some behavior that we think on its face, yes, this could limit someone's ability to benefit from the things that we're offering here on campus. But think about it in the context of some of the other areas of discrimination. If someone walks by me on campus and says, a racial slur, is that now limiting my ability or interfering with my ability to do my job, and it was a one-time, one-off situation? Probably not when you talk about creating a hostile environment. And I say that to illustrate that creating a hostile environment is a very, very high bar. And there's a lot of factors that go into it when we think about it. I'm the interim provost right now. If I said an inappropriate comment to a female that was, maybe in a unit that reports up to me, that inappropriate comment might quite possibly could create a hostile environment, but it's based on the relationship we have. And so we look at a host of different factors. And so I say that to illustrate that it's a very, very high bar when we start talking about creating a hostile environment. It's not a subjective, my feelings are hurt, or I don't like what you said, but it has to literally be in a place where we've created a condition where individuals can't benefit from what we're offering. And so I say that to just illustrate that's a clear distinction from I don't like what you said or hate speech, to use the things that Dr. Kinsley cited to as well, or Professor Kinsley cited to as well. So that's all I have, but I wanted to touch on the administrative piece. And so, Laura, we can open it up for questions now if we want to.
Thank you both so much. So I'll go ahead and start with the first question. So what is a respectful way to engage or dismantle hate speech when we encounter it as students?
I don't know, Professor Kinsley, if you want to go first. I have my ideas, but you can take a stab at it first.
Sure. So to really be true to the First Amendment, the right response to hate speech is more speech, right? So the first step is to enter the conversation, to be willing to speak up, to be willing to call out the person who has expressed an idea that is hateful or harmful in some way. I say that as a person who acknowledges my privilege in that regard, right? So some of us have more privilege to be able to choose when to encounter hate speech than other people do. But choosing to speak up is the first step. And then I think, there are different methodologies for how to approach someone. You can be incredibly confrontational. You can say, I don't agree with you. That's wrong. You're uninformed. Here's why, right? Or you could take a more tactful approach. So the person who asked this question asked about respect. One thing you might do is ask the other person why they think that. Why do they think that way? What is it that makes them feel that thing? What experiences have they had? What inputs have they had, right? Oftentimes when you break apart hate speech and why people are saying it, you come to understand that they're repeating things that they have heard in their environment because they've never been told that it's wrong. They've never been challenged in that regard, and they've never been exposed to other ideas. So you can ask them why they think that thing, and then you can explain why that's not right in your experience and how your experience has been different. So I think speaking up is critical. When we look kind of across the world, there have been some really effective models in this regard, especially in Germany, following World War II and confronting kind of the rise of neo-Nazism recently. So entire cities have created sort of parades that go around the outside of the very small number of people, white supremacists who are marching. So kind of literally physically surrounding the speech with better speech is something that you can do. I've seen really, actually, I'm an alumni of the University of Florida, and after the basketball game last night, I don't want to admit that, but in terms of like looking at what students can do on campus when white supremacist speakers come to speak, there was a great response at the University of Florida where all of the tickets to the particular event, I think it was Richard Spencer, were reserved by students who were opposed to his message. They all distributed newspapers, and when he came out to speak, every single person in the crowd opened up a newspaper so that he was literally looking at nothing and no one. So there are ways that you can confront this speech by more speech, right? That is always the remedy. And the fact that you asked the question shows me that you're willing to enter the conversation, and that's important to changing hearts and minds.
I wouldn't add anything to that. I agree. One of the things and biggest concerns I have dealing with students, interacting with students, is we let those individuals with these counter views steal our voice. If you've noticed, you look on campus, whenever we have somebody we don't like, rather than in that moment calling it out, saying what it is, saying why it's counter to our views, counter to our culture, counter to our values here at campus, we give that individual a platform. And then our knee-jerk response is to go and say, hey, you all need to do something to get rid of them. How is the university responding to get rid of this person? But you have to remember something. You all hold all the power right here. If you've ever been in a situation where someone had a view like that and the individuals in that room came together and said, you know what, we don't agree with that. And we don't agree with that because X, Y, Z. That's probably one of the most powerful ways that you on campus can combat speech. And again, doing it in a very respectful way, recognizing that, from my own personal experience, and I can talk about lived experiences, the time where I've engaged individuals who've had differing views from me, but I did in a respectful way to really see where they were coming from their vantage point and giving them an opportunity to really look into my vantage point. Those have been some of the strongest takeaways where, maybe you don't change minds, but you do open up perspectives. And so again, I would encourage all of our students, when confronted with these situations, before we say, hey, it's how is the university going to respond to this? Because, we talk kind of high level framework, what we can and what we cannot do. Think about how you all respond to it in student, because I think you all unified are much stronger than anything we could do from a policy standpoint.
Thank you both. The next question, I think, Professor Kinsley, this one's probably for you following your presentation, but what are some examples of fighting words and how is it distinct from other unprotected categories of speech?
So the fighting words doctrine is not fully fleshed out. And when you look at cases across the country, and I think Dr. Durage's presentation kind of gives a sense of this, the cases are kind of all over the place. So it's really difficult for me to tell you something that will always be determined to be fighting words. The kind of example that gets raised sometimes, and I think this is very much a stereotype, so I'm hesitant to repeat it, but it's kind of like the your mama jokes, not jokes, like your mama insults, or maybe saying something very, very derogatory about someone's life partner or children, these kinds of very toxic, hurtful, personally directed comments that would cause someone to be so angry and upset that they would immediately react in some kind of violent way. Now, as I'm describing that, you can probably tell that is very fact specific and very context dependent, right? So it's going to vary from person to person, time to time, and place to place. You may have seen, and I'm hesitant to go too much in this direction, but the fighting words doctrine has kind of been in discussion a lot lately because the Kentucky Senate recently passed a bill making it a crime to insult a police officer in a way that would be fighting words to that police officer. So, this is a doctrine that's kind of being resurrected. It's really old in terms of First Amendment law, and it's being resurrected now as the government tries to constrain what we can and can't say.
Dr. Durjai, did you want to add anything?
For me, I was gonna say, if you talk about my mom, that's generally the fighting words. But but all jokes aside, it is very, very. It's not clear again, and it's one of those areas that there's a subjective and objective aspect to it. Probably now, I say recently, but it's probably before all of you all were in college, when there were the protests at the University of Missouri. There were a couple of situations where students made comments to other students in the midst of the protests that were going on that fell under that fighting words piece that elicited that violent response immediately based on the context of what's going on. But again, it's always going to be very, very fact specific when you think about those type of situations.
Thank you. Our next question says, how can the university help prevent psychological harm against minorities? The event this past summer disturbed many minority students and in turn has caused psychological harm. How can an institution pride itself of an inclusive environment when minority students don't feel safe from psychological or even physical harm?
So that's a really good question. There's a lot of different parts. And so, high level, before I would get into the nuances of how we respond from a trauma standpoint, I think it's also making sure that you have a campus full of leaders that are informed about what the issues are. And so I think for starters, we as administrators and faculty members and staff members have to make sure we're aware of specifically, because you asked about our minority students, what are the lived experiences they have and how these lived experiences are impacting them on a day-to-day basis. I'll be honest, I recognize that being a person of color and being in the role that I currently am is something that for minority students is a sense of pride, and it's something we can engage in. And so I also recognize that the experiences of all minority students on campus are not always positive. But I think we've got to make sure that we're having these conversations, that we're paying close attention to these issues. And I'm not saying from a standpoint that we treat anybody different, but making sure that we're in tune with the challenges that students are dealing with and how we serve them is important. Another big piece about it is I think we've got to do a better job of how we put support services in place and how we fund and support and, put adequate resources around the support services that are on campus. When you think about from a student standpoint, Lauren, you know this very well. Many of our student-facing programs that are for minority students are severely understaffed. They're severely understaffed and severely under-resources. And so when we're trying to create community and create places for our minority students, we've got to make sure we put resources there. Now, I know Dr. Howard, new VP of Student Affairs, is really committed to that work. And I think we'll see some changes in that work as well, because, for minority students to feel part of the NKU community, so to speak, I think first we've got to create a place where they feel like they can build their own community. The research says, and everyone knows this, if individuals feel comfortable in their skin, they feel comfortable, they feel like they have a community, they're much more likely and much more inclined to engage with other individuals. And so we at the university have to build spaces where minority students can build community. And then I think the next step we've got to do is we've got to take that next step and think about how we can make sure that our different communities that are comfortable in this current space we have are now interacting amongst each other to promote that inclusion we talk about. So, it's one of those areas that there's a lot of steps to. It starts with making sure that we're in tune with what's going on. Next is creating spaces where we can build community. And thirdly is thinking, how do we get into these intergroup dialogues? How do we start, doing research about the things that promote inclusion, real high level inclusion? How do we think about this idea of creating a sense of belonging, and how do we constantly evaluate it on a continuous basis? Because that's the other big important thing about anytime you're doing diversity, equity, inclusion work. There is no finish line. There is no end goal, so to speak. It's one of those things that has to be continuous. We have to continue to refine the work we're doing, because again, that thin line between inclusion and feeling excluded is very, very small, and it's very fragile. And it takes one incident, like something like graffiti or hate speech, that negatively impacts all the good work that we've been doing thus far. So it's a consistent process, a consistent struggle, but it's something we have to be fully engaged in.
There's just maybe a couple more things that I would add to that. First of all, I think it's important to acknowledge the harm. To just say, I see you. I see the pain that you are experiencing. There's this statement that came from a sing-song rhyme. Sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me. Well, that's just simply not true. Words do hurt people. And so I think it's important to acknowledge that as a starting point. And then also, I probably should have added this to my slides, but there's this emerging doctrine of First Amendment law called the government speech doctrine. And the government is actually allowed to say things. The government is allowed to enter the marketplace and to say things on its own behalf. This actually comes from the license plate cases. So you may have noticed that people can personalize their license plates, right? And some license plates, there's even an NKU one that you can get. Some license plates have, they stand for different things. They're different organizations or mottos and whatnot. And that's the government actually creating those license plates and providing them to you, right? So I think in this conversation, you know, NKU can enter it. NKU can say, you know, yes, because of the First Amendment, we are required to, you know, provide a platform for this speaker. We can't exclude someone because we dislike their speech, et cetera. But we also oppose their speech. We'll allow it to go forward, but we don't agree with it. It's wrong. We don't agree with it. We don't stand for it. It's not what we're about. And so I think that is important. I know NKU has done that, and I think, you know, we'll continue to do that. And I think that's an important part of the conversation too, for NKU to acknowledge the harm and then enter the conversation in a way that says that we don't stand for these hateful ideas.
One thing I would add, and as Professor Kinsley was talking, it made me think about it. And she's right, NKU has jumped in. We've responded to these. We've entered the conversation. But I would emphasize, and I think students think about this, but also our faculty staff, we've also got to have action behind our statements. And so simply saying we don't stand for it, but not doing additional things. You know, she used the perfect example of Richard Spencer. You know, when I was at another institution, we hosted Richard Spencer. And so, you know, Richard Spencer, if you're familiar, he says some things that are counter to a lot of people's views on our campus. And so we had a huge campus, and we did give him a public forum to present at, but it was a barn that was on an outpost at the farthest end of campus with no parking. And so I say that to emphasize that I think we definitely have to get into the conversation, but we also have to make sure that our actions align with what we're saying. You know, when we say things like we promote inclusion, but we only promote it when it's appropriate or benefiting us, then I think that sends a mixed message. So I think it's important to make sure that we are coupling action with any time we make a statement as well.
I want to be mindful of time, but I have two more questions I'd like to end with. The first one says, how can we be good citizens of free speech on campus and create environments where people feel safe to express their opinions, regardless of their popularity, but also an environment that people who may disagree with these opinions feel safe?
You know, I think, and so I'll use some examples I've seen in the classroom, especially the undergraduate level. You know, I think faculty members explaining that, you know, a lot of different courses, you know, Professor Kinsey's in law school, but there's a lot of courses we're going to discuss topics that will impact people, that people have some strong opinions about. You know, when you think about our poli-sci majors and many of the majors in our College of Arts and Sciences, I think what our faculty members, and I think they've done a really good job, is setting ground rules at the beginning, making sure that, hey, this is a place where we're going to explore things and discuss things that individuals have different opinions. We want to make sure that, I don't like to use this term, but we've got a safe space or a place where individuals can express their different viewpoints respectfully, and we're going to be open to all of them. And so I think if we can do that, if faculty members can continue to make sure that's kind of their ground rules for operation, I think that could go a long way in helping the conversation. You know, the other thing you asked about, as students, what can we do? You know, here's another thing, and this is tough. It's a big leap of faith of student. You know, I think about you, Lauren, as the president, and having to go out and speak in favor of a principle that might be something people are using to promote that's something that counter to what you believe. But I think if we have our students who are saying, hey, this is important to us, and we want to make sure that everybody has an opportunity to have a voice, even if we don't like that voice, I think it goes a long way to showing other individuals that, hey, we do value this, and we do value an opportunity for individuals to speak, but we also recognize that it may be counter to what we're doing. And you are therefore engaging, creating a process where individuals know, hey, you know, this discourse, this dialogue is part of what we do. You know, I mentioned when we were talking, but if we send you all to college, you come and you matriculate in 4 years, and at the end of 4 years, you haven't encountered any different perspectives. You haven't even challenged the current perspectives you have. We've done you all a great disservice. And so it's incumbent upon us to make sure we create spaces where you can engage, where you can do things like that. And if our students are thinking that way and thinking about that as well, especially our SGA student leaders, I think we're moving in the right direction.
I also think it's important, as Dr. Durjai said, to keep the focus on the educational process. None of us were born knowing everything. None of us still to this day know everything. None of us have all of our lives completely figured out at any given moment, right? So we need to allow each other the grace and space to be imperfect. We need to come to campus with open minds, recognizing that our experience might be different than other people's. And we need to see value in that shared experience of learning and growing together, even when we walk away disagreeing. Because let's face it, there's probably no two people on the planet who perfectly agree on every single thing all of the time, right? We are born unique and different. And so we bring those uniquenesses and those differences to campus, and we leave with them too. And I think that's a good thing.
And then the last question, Dr. Durjai, where can students report incidences of hate speech on campus? And if those incidences don't fall into unprotected speech, what other support resources do students have at their disposal?
So it's a good question. So you can report, we have now bias incident protocols on the Inclusive Excellence website that students can report any of these things. And so as you report, you'll have someone who reach out to you, will connect with you to talk about and connect you with the resources on campus that we have around this. So, if it's counseling services, those are things that we'd be able to connect our students with as well. One of the things that I think is really, really important for us to emphasize, and so I'll use the example of Title IX, not a couple years, but now it's been over a decade when there was a big influx of how we looked at Title IX on campus. And there was a big push on the resources that we had on campus to support victims of Title IX. And one of the things that we've got to make sure our thinking is, well, there's other forms of situations of discrimination, harassment, or even just bias that have, a negative impact on students. So I think we've got to take a very holistic view about how we do that. I think NKU's taking the right steps. Daryl Peel, our new Chief Diversity Officer, is really, really focused on that. I know he's engaged with a lot of student groups to talk about what's going on and how do we bolster the supports we have on campus. And so, what I would say for our students is hold us accountable in that space. If we feel that we don't have enough resources for that, that would be something that I would encourage being vocal about, connecting with me, connecting with Dr. Eddie Howard as well, to make sure that's something that we focus and make sure that it's in place, because we know it's important. It impacts our students. And so quite frankly, we have to do a better job about it. And we are, but again, hold us accountable and make sure we continue what we're doing.
Thank you both. As we approach our hour, I guess I'm going to have one final question, and that's just if you guys have any closing thoughts you want to leave our students with tonight.
I just want to congratulate all of you for having this conversation. I think it's important to talk about. I think it's important to flesh out. Obviously, all of us have an interest in making everyone feel included and welcome and providing equal access to educational opportunities for everyone, regardless of what ideas you bring with you when you come. So I think this has really been a good conversation, and I appreciate the SGA leaders for putting it together.
Yeah, I would echo everything she said. I'm really proud of you all of thinking about this, recognizing how important it is and how much of a major issue it is. And so tackling it head on and continually tackling it head on, I think that's really, really important. Right now we're in this space where a lot of things have been happening. And so speech is an issue. It's an issue right now. But I would encourage you all who are current leaders, who will be leaders going forward, to make sure this doesn't go by the wayside, to make sure that, when things are great and people aren't talking about this next year, it not be a topic, because it's going to continue to be a topic. We need to make sure we're continuing to tackle this issue of not only speech, but also how we create this culture and the society that promotes these ideas that we all believe in and hold dear to ourselves. So again, I'm really proud of you all. I think you're doing great things and great work. And, however I can help, please let me know.
Thank you both. I saw a new question in the chat. If you want to send me your emails, you can send them to sga@nku.edu, and we'll try to connect you with whoever or get an answer for you. So if you guys have any remaining questions as we leave this, please, again, send them to sga@nku.edu, and we'll try to get back to you. Thank you to both of our presenters so much for giving up your Monday night to speak to us about this. Thank you to all of our students who are here and to Tracy for putting it on. I hope you guys have a great night, and thanks for coming.